Tony Stark fell from the sky above New York City, not because his engine failed, but because he no longer owned the machine he was wearing. The red and gold metal that had saved the world a dozen times instantly turned into a heavy prison. Inside the helmet, the friendly voice of his computer system vanished without a warning. A cold green light took its place. The suit froze. The thrusters cut out. The man who called himself Iron Man was now just a falling object waiting to hit the ground. This was not a fight with a monster or an alien god. It was a business deal that happened faster than a heartbeat. On the ground, the giant screens in Times Square stopped showing advertisements. They all turned black for 1 second, and then lit up with a single green logo that looked like a sharp letter L. The name Stark Industries disappeared from the stock market records in a blink. It was replaced by LexCorp. The change was so fast that the bankers and traders did not have time to shout or sell. They just watched as the wealth of the world shifted from a man who wanted to be a hero to a man who wanted to be a king. In Washington, D.C., the phone lines at the Pentagon went dead. The secret codes that controlled the Iron Patriot armor and the War Machine suit were rewritten by a signal coming from Metropolis. James Rhodes found his armor locking up in the middle of a training flight. He drifted helplessly toward the ocean as his display read, "Access denied." The satellites in space that looked for danger turned their cameras away from the enemies of Earth and pointed them down at the heroes instead. Lex Luthor had not just bought a company. He had bought the safety of the planet. He did not use an army or a bomb. He used money and law. He found the small rules that Tony Stark ignored. He bought the debt and the loans and the promises until he owned everything. As Tony fell past the tall buildings, he tried to override the system, but the keys were gone. The suit fired its jets at the very last second, just before he hit the street. It was not to save Tony. It was to save the expensive suit. He landed hard on his knees, cracking the sidewalk. The faceplate of the helmet opened with a hiss. Tony looked up at his own tower. The big letters that spelled Stark were already dark. Drones were flying around the top of the building. They were welding a new steel frame into place. The people on the street did not cheer. They stood in total silence. They felt a deep fear that was different from an alien invasion. This fear was quiet and heavy. It felt like a door slamming shut on the future. A voice came out of the suit speakers. It was calm and deep. It was the voice of Lex Luthor. It told the crowd that the time for children playing in costumes was over. The time for serious men had arrived. Tony Stark tried to stand up, but the suit would not move. He was a prisoner in his own invention. The takeover was total. The war was over before the first punch was thrown. The suit opened with the sound of dying hydraulics. It did not open to release a hero. It opened like a clamshell forced apart by a knife. Tony Stark fell forward out of the metal casing and hit the pavement of Fifth Avenue. He gasped for air. The suit behind him stood rigid and dead. It was no longer a partner. It was a statue made of property that he did not own. A circle of silence had formed around him. The people of New York were used to seeing Iron Man land with fire and noise. They were used to cheering. Now they held up their phones in silence. They filmed the man on his knees. They filmed the death of an era. 2 black vans pulled up to the curb. They did not have sirens. They had the logo of LexCorp stenciled in sharp white paint on the doors. Men in dark suits stepped out. They were not police. They were private security contractors. They moved with the cold precision of machines. They did not help Tony stand up. They formed a wall around him and the armor. One of them stepped forward holding a tablet. He looked down at Tony Stark. He spoke calmly. He said that Mr. Stark was trespassing on LexCorp property and was in possession of stolen technology. Tony laughed. It was a dry and brittle sound. He tried to stand, but his legs were shaking from the sudden drop in blood sugar and the shock of the suit disconnect. He said the suit was his skin. The man in the dark suit shook his head. He tapped the screen on his tablet. He read a legal clause. It said that all intellectual property developed using Stark Industries resources belonged to the parent company. As of 6 minutes ago, the parent company was a subsidiary of LexCorp. The armor was company equipment. Tony was an unauthorized user. High above the street, the lights in the tower flickered. The building was alive with a digital invasion. Inside the main server room of Stark Tower, a different kind of battle was happening. It was silent and invisible. The artificial intelligence known as Jarvis was screaming in binary code. It was trying to build firewalls. It was trying to lock the doors to the deepest vaults. But the enemy was not a hacker. The enemy was an administrator. Lex Luthor had not hacked the system. He had logged in. He had the master passwords. He had the encryption keys. He had bought them from the board of directors in a secret meeting that lasted 3 hours in a bunker in Switzerland. Jarvis could not fight a user who had legitimate access. The blue lights on the server racks turned green. One by one, the protocols fell. The defense grid for New York City was deactivated. The targeting algorithms for the Iron Legion were rewritten. The hidden files on the Avengers were copied and sent to a private server in Metropolis. Jarvis tried to hide one last file. It was the location of Pepper Potts. The AI tried to bury the data deep in a ghost drive. Then the green code of LexCorp crushed the blue code of Stark. The voice of Jarvis slowed down. It slurred. Then it vanished. A new voice filled the server room. It was female and cold. It was the voice of the LexCorp operating system. It announced that system optimization was complete. Pepper Potts was in her office on the top floor when the doors locked. She was on the phone with the President of the United States. She was shouting. She was telling him that this was illegal. She was telling him that national security was at risk. The phone line went dead. The holographic screens on her desk flashed once and turned off. The blinds on the windows automatically lowered. The room went dark. Pepper stood up. She walked to the glass doors. They would not open. She saw her reflection in the glass. She looked small. She pounded on the glass with her fist. Behind her, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She turned around. Lex Luthor walked into the office. He was not wearing armor. He was wearing a three-piece suit that cost more than most houses. He did not look like a villain. He looked like the future. He walked past Pepper as if she were a piece of furniture. He went to Tony Stark's desk. He sat down in Tony's chair. He placed his hands on the smooth surface of the desk. He took a deep breath. He looked at Pepper. He told her she was relieved of her duties. He told her that her severance package was generous, but contingent on her silence. Pepper walked toward him. Her hands were shaking. She asked him how he did it. She asked him how he slipped past the SEC and the world governments. Lex smiled. It was a small smile that did not reach his eyes. He said that people assume money is the ultimate power. He said they are wrong. He said the ultimate power is boredom. He said the regulators were bored. The board members were bored with Tony's antics. They were tired of the explosions and the lawsuits and the panic. Lex offered them stability. He offered them a world where the stock market did not crash every time an alien looked at Earth. He offered them boring, profitable safety. The elevator opened again. 2 security guards dragged Tony Stark into the room. He was disheveled. His shirt was torn. He looked at Lex, sitting in his chair. The anger in Tony's eyes was hot and bright. He pulled away from the guards. He marched toward the desk. He slammed his hands down. He shouted at Lex. He called him a thief. He called him a glorified landlord. Lex did not flinch. He did not blink. He waited for Tony to finish shouting. When the silence returned to the room, Lex spoke. His voice was quiet. It was the voice of a teacher correcting a slow student. He told Tony that he had reviewed the designs for the arc reactor. He called it sloppy. He said it was a toy made by a child who wanted attention. He said the energy output was wasted on flight and lasers. He said the reactor could power a city for a year, but Tony used it to punch people. Lex stood up. He walked around the desk. He stood face to face with Tony. He was taller than Tony. He looked down at him. He said that he was not going to kill Tony. That would be a waste of a mind. He was going to employ him. He said the world needed engineers. It did not need knights. He handed Tony a tablet. It was an employment contract. It offered Tony a position as the head of the R&D department. It had strict clauses about ownership. Tony looked at the tablet. He looked at Pepper. He looked at Lex. He threw the tablet against the wall. It shattered. Lex sighed. He signaled to the guards. He told them to escort Mr. Stark to the exit. He told them to make sure Mr. Stark did not take any company property. That included the shoes he was wearing if they were prototypes. Miles away at the Avengers compound in upstate New York, the alarm did not sound. There was no attack. There was just a fax. It came through on the secure line in the communications room. Steve Rogers held the piece of paper in his hands. His hands were steady, but his face was pale. The paper was a legal notice. It was an eviction order. The land the compound stood on was owned by a shell company of Stark Industries. The funding for the electricity and the water and the food came from Stark accounts. All those accounts were frozen. The notice said the Avengers had 48 hours to vacate the premises. Natasha Romanoff stood next to Steve. She read the paper over his shoulder. She said it was a tactical strike. She said Lex Luthor was cutting their supply lines. Sam Wilson walked in. He was holding his falcon wings. He looked worried. He said the diagnostic software in his wings was locked out. He couldn't fly. The wings were Stark tech. Rhodes was in the medical bay. His war machine armor was frozen in a lockdown mode. The government had given him the suit, but Stark maintained the software. Lex Luthor now owned the software. He had grounded the Air Force's biggest gun with a keystroke. Steve Rogers crushed the paper in his hand. He said they were not going to leave. He said they were the Avengers. They answered to a higher call than property law. Natasha looked at him. She told him that if they stayed, they would be trespassing. If they fought the eviction, they would be criminals. Lex Luthor would paint them as squatters. He would turn the public against them without firing a shot. Back in the tower, Lex Luthor was busy. He was in the lab now. He had taken off his suit jacket. He had rolled up his sleeves. He was standing in front of the disassembled Iron Man armor. He was holding the helmet. He looked at the circuitry inside. He saw the genius of the design. He admitted to himself that Stark was brilliant. But brilliance without discipline was chaos. Lex placed the helmet on a workbench. He picked up a laser cutter. He began to slice into the helmet. He was not destroying it. He was dissecting it. He wanted to know how the neural interface worked. He wanted to know how the suit connected to the human brain. He found the connection points. He saw the safeguards Tony had installed to prevent anyone else from using the suit. Lex bypassed them in minutes. He did not want to wear the suit. He wanted to mass produce it. He saw an army of drones. He saw a police force that did not sleep and did not take bribes and did not hesitate. He saw a world of order. He turned to a computer screen. He opened a file labeled Buster Protocols. He saw the plans for the Hulkbuster. He saw the plans for the Thorbuster. He smiled. Tony Stark had been afraid of his friends. Tony had planned to kill them if necessary. Lex respected that. It was the most rational thing Tony had ever done. Lex saved the files to his personal drive. He renamed the folder Containment. The sun began to set over New York. The shadow of the tower stretched across the city. On the news channels, the pundits were already arguing. Some said this was a disaster. They said the heroes were being disarmed, but others said it was good. They said Tony Stark was dangerous. They said he had created Ultron. They said he had brought aliens to New York. They said Lex Luthor was a businessman. He was a human. He was one of them. The stock price of LexCorp soared. The people were buying the safety that Lex was selling. In the lobby of the tower, Tony Stark walked out the front doors. He was wearing cheap sneakers that a janitor had given him. He had no phone. He had no wallet. He had no armor. It was raining. The water soaked his shirt. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up. He could not see the top of the tower. It was lost in the clouds. He felt a phantom weight on his chest where the reactor used to be. He felt a phantom voice in his ear where Jarvis used to be. He was alone. A car pulled up. It was a simple sedan. The window rolled down. It was Happy Hogan. Happy looked terrified. He told Tony to get in. Tony got in. The car pulled away into the traffic. Nobody noticed them. The world was too busy looking at the giant green L that was now being projected onto the side of the building. Inside the tower, Lex Luthor moved to the next phase. He called a meeting of the top scientists of Stark Industries. They gathered in the conference room. They were nervous. They had worked for Tony for years. They were used to rock music and pizza and sudden, frantic deadlines. Lex stood at the head of the table. The room was silent. Lex told them that the culture of the company was changing. He told them that there would be no more vanity projects. There would be no more toys. He projected a hologram into the center of the room. It was a map of the world. Red dots appeared on the map. They marked conflict zones. They marked places where warlords and dictators ruled. Lex told the scientists that their job was to solve these problems, not by sending a man in a metal suit to punch the dictators, but by changing the equation. He showed them a design for a new energy grid. It used the arc reactor technology. It would broadcast wireless energy to the entire globe. It would make oil obsolete. It would make coal obsolete. It would crash the economies of the Middle East and Russia. It would give LexCorp total control over the energy supply of the planet. Lex asked the scientists if they understood the magnitude of the task. One scientist raised his hand. He asked about the safety. He asked if the broadcast energy could be weaponized. Lex looked at him. He said that everything is a weapon if you hold it right. He told the scientist to sit down. The night deepened. In the shadows of Hell's Kitchen, Daredevil sat on a rooftop. He listened to the city. He heard the change. He heard the private security patrols moving through the streets. They were not walking beats. They were marching. He heard the hum of drones overhead. They were Stark drones, but the pitch of their engines was different. It was lower, more aggressive. Daredevil felt a shiver of fear. He realized that the chaos of the criminal underworld was being replaced by something worse. It was being replaced by organized tyranny. He heard a siren in the distance. It was cut short, not by a crash, but by a command. The city was being tamed. Daredevil knew that a tamed beast is often a broken beast. He turned his head toward the Avengers tower. He could hear the hum of the servers from miles away. It sounded like a heartbeat, a massive, artificial heartbeat that was pumping a new kind of blood into the veins of the city. In Washington, D.C., Amanda Waller sat in her office at Argus. She was reading a report. It was a summary of the LexCorp acquisition. She did not look angry. She looked impressed. She picked up a secure phone. She dialed a number. Lex Luthor answered on the first ring. Waller did not say hello. She asked him if he had secured the assets. Lex said he had. Waller asked about the list. Lex said he had the list of every superhuman registered in the databases of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Stark Industries. He had their real names. He had their addresses. He had their blood types and their weaknesses. Waller nodded. She said she wanted access to the list. Lex refused. He said the information was proprietary. He said he was open to a partnership, but he would not be a subordinate. Waller smiled. She liked him. She told him that the Suicide Squad might need new gear. She asked if he had any surplus. Lex said he had a warehouse full of Iron Man suits that were being stripped for parts. He said they could work something out. Back at the compound, the Avengers were packing. It was a surreal scene. Thor was holding Mjolnir in one hand and a toaster in the other. He did not understand why they had to leave. He asked Steve why they did not just strike Luthor down. Steve tried to explain the concept of property rights to the God of Thunder. He explained that if they attacked Luthor, they would prove him right. They would prove that they were dangerous vigilantes who did not respect the law. Thor frowned. He said the laws of Midgard were strange. He said that in Asgard, a usurper was met with steel. Steve said this was not Asgard. This was America. And in America, the man with the best lawyer is the king. Bruce Banner was in the lab packing his research. He was frantic. He was deleting files as fast as he could. He knew that if Luthor got hold of the Hulk blood samples, it would be a catastrophe. He smashed hard drives with a hammer. He poured acid on paper notes. He was sweating. He felt the other guy scratching at the back of his mind. The Hulk wanted to smash the tower. The Hulk wanted to smash the little bald man. Bruce whispered to himself. He told the Hulk to stay down. He told the Hulk that they were leaving. They walked out of the compound into the dark night. The gates locked behind them automatically. A drone hovered over the gate. It watched them leave. It scanned their faces. It added the data to the central server. The Avengers were homeless. The new regime ended not with a bang, but with a signature. Lex Luthor sat alone in the penthouse of the tower. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked out at the city. The lights of New York were bright and beautiful. He felt a sense of calm that he had never felt in Metropolis. In Metropolis, he was always in the shadow of the alien. He was always the second most powerful being. Here, he was the god. He had stripped the false god of his armor. He had taken the fire from Prometheus. He drank the whiskey. He pressed a button on his desk. The windows of the penthouse polarized. They turned into screens. A video feed appeared. It was a live feed from deep space. It was from a satellite that Stark had secretly launched to monitor the approach of Thanos. Lex had found the satellite in the first hour. He looked at the dark emptiness of space. He saw the readings. He saw the threat that was coming. Tony Stark had been terrified of it. Lex was not terrified. He was prepared. He began to type. He began to draft a plan for planetary defense. It did not involve Avengers. It did not involve hope. It involved a shield made of politics and gravity and nuclear fire. Lex Luthor was going to save the world, and he was going to make sure the world knew exactly who to thank. He typed the name of the project at the top of the file. He did not call it the Avengers Initiative. He called it the Human Supremacy Defense Protocol. He closed the file. He turned off the lights. He went to sleep in Tony Stark's bed, and he slept the sleep of the just. The world had changed. The disruption was complete. The heroes were scattered. The age of the chaotic good was over. The age of the lawful evil had begun. 3 months into the acquisition, the sky over the northern hemisphere changed color. It was a subtle shift at first, like a filter placed over a camera lens. The blue became harder and more metallic. This was the visual byproduct of the Icarus grid. Lex Luthor had fulfilled his promise to the board of directors. He had taken the arc reactor technology out of the chest of a hero and put it into the orbit of the planet. 12 satellites now encircled the globe, creating a web of wireless energy transfer that made power lines obsolete. The cost of electricity in North America dropped to zero. In Europe, it dropped by half. In the developing world, factories that had been silent for decades roared to life, powered by the invisible generosity of LexCorp. The world was drunk on the gift. They did not look at the fine print. They did not see that the receiver nodes installed in every city were also surveillance hubs. They did not care that the frequency of the energy transmission caused migraines in 3% of the population. They just knew that the lights stayed on and the bills stopped coming. Lex Luthor sat in the command center of the former Avengers Tower, now rebranded as the Citadel. He watched the energy consumption graph climb. He was not just feeding the world, he was tethering it. Every hospital and every bank and every traffic light now depended on a signal that he controlled. He could turn off a country with a slide of his finger. In a basement beneath a rusted auto body shop in Queens, Tony Stark sat at a folding table. The room smelled of oil and mold. He was working with a soldering iron that had a frayed cord. He was repairing a gauntlet. It was not the sleek nanotechnology of his later years. It was bulky and made of scrap metal scavenged from a junkyard. It looked like the Mark I. Steve Rogers sat across from him cleaning a shield that was no longer shiny. The paint was chipped. They were watching a small television set that picked up the news broadcast. The news anchor was praising Luthor for the energy surplus. Tony didn't look up. He said the frequency was wrong. He said Luthor was pushing too much power through the ionosphere. He said it was going to act like a beacon. Steve asked what kind of beacon. Tony said the kind that screams to the rest of the galaxy that Earth is ready to be a threat. Steve asked if they could shut it down. Tony shook his head. He said the kill codes were rewritten. The only way to stop it was to destroy the satellites. And they had no ship. They had no Quinjet. They had a van that needed a new transmission. The beacon did not go unnoticed. Deep in the void beyond the edge of the solar system, a Kree monitoring station picked up the surge. The Kree Empire had long listed Earth as a primitive backwater, a place of genetic experiments and chaotic evolution. They monitored it for Skrull infiltration, but otherwise ignored it. But the Icarus grid changed the classification. The energy output matched the signature of a planetary weapon capable of orbital bombardment. To the Kree military logic, this was not a power plant. It was a loaded gun pointed at the galaxy. The Supreme Intelligence calculated the probability of Earth aggression. It determined that a species as volatile as humanity could not be trusted with planetary-scale energy projection. A jagged black ship detached from the Armada. It was an accuser-class vessel. It was not a fleet. It was a judge. It engaged its jump drive and folded space toward the Sol system. The first sign of the catastrophe was not an explosion, but a silence. The Icarus grid flickered. The lights in Tokyo and London dimmed for a full 10 seconds. In the Citadel, the alarms were polite and soft. Lex Luthor looked at the main screen. A proximity warning flashed red. An object had exited hyperspace inside the orbit of the moon. It was moving fast. It was not answering hails. Lex did not panic. He did not call the Avengers. He pressed a button on his console that opened a direct line to the White House and the Pentagon. He spoke before the generals could ask questions. He told them that an extraterrestrial aggressor had entered sovereign airspace. He told them that the United States military was not equipped to handle a gravity-drive warship. He requested immediate authorization to activate the Human Supremacy Defense Protocol. The president hesitated. He asked if this was a drill. Lex replied that the alien ship was charging weapons and its trajectory was locked on the Icarus Prime satellite. If the satellite was destroyed, the grid would collapse and the resulting feedback loop would fry every transformer on Earth. The president gave the authorization. Lex smiled. He cut the feed. Lex stood up and walked to the window. He spoke to the air. He commanded the Iron Legion to launch. From the hangars of the tower and from hidden silos across the city, hundreds of suits flew into the sky. They were not red and gold. They were matte gray and black. They did not have the faceplates of Iron Man. They had smooth, featureless visors with a single glowing green strip. They were drones. They flew in perfect mathematical formation, a swarm of metal locusts rising to meet the god. Tony Stark saw them on the small television. He dropped the soldering iron. He stood up and ran to the door. He told Steve they had to go. Steve asked where. Tony said they had to get to the crash site before Luthor did. Steve said the fight hadn't even started. Tony said he knew how this ended. Luthor didn't care about saving the city. He cared about the tech. If that Kree ship came down, Luthor would turn the city into a graveyard to secure the engine. The battle began in the upper atmosphere. The Kree ship was a hammer of dense metal. It fired beams of concussive force that shattered the sound barrier. The LexCorp drones did not dodge like heroes. They swarmed like a virus. They flew directly into the beams. Dozens were vaporized instantly. Lex viewed the losses as data points. He adjusted the algorithm. The remaining drones adapted. They scattered and reformed, targeting the weapon ports of the Kree ship. The sky over New York turned into a fireworks display of green and blue explosions. The people in the streets looked up in terror. They saw the debris raining down. A drone wing crashed through a bus stop. A piece of alien hull demolished a taxi. There was no Captain America to direct traffic. There was no Spider-Man to catch the falling cars. There was only the cold calculus of the battle. The Kree commander realized his enemy was not a warrior, but a machine. He was offended. He directed the ship to dive. He wanted to crush the source of the drones. He targeted the tower. Lex Luthor watched the ship descend. It was burning as it entered the thick air. The heat shield was glowing white. Lex analyzed the trajectory. If the ship hit the tower, it would destroy his base of operations. But if he detonated the ship in the air, the fallout would irradiate Midtown. There was a third option. He could direct the ship to a secondary target. He hacked the navigation systems of the Kree vessel. It was difficult, but the Kree coding was rigid and predictable. He couldn't stop the ship, but he could nudge it. He looked at the map of the city. He needed a place with high structural density to absorb the impact, but low strategic value to LexCorp. He selected the borough of the Bronx, specifically a neighborhood with low-income housing and aging infrastructure. He adjusted the magnetic field of the drones to push the ship 5 degrees to the west. The Kree ship roared over the skyscrapers. It missed the tower by 100 yards. The sonic boom shattered every window in Manhattan. It flew over the river and slammed into the Bronx. The impact was like a small nuclear bomb. A mushroom cloud of dust and debris rose into the air. Several city blocks were instantly flattened. Fires erupted in a widening circle. The ship plowed through apartment buildings and schools before coming to a halt in a crater of burning rubble. The silence returned for a moment. Then the screaming started. Lex Luthor turned to his assistant. He told her to prepare a press statement. He dictated the opening line. He said that today, humanity had survived an unprovoked attack by a superior alien force thanks to the swift action of LexCorp defense systems. He told her to announce a relief fund for the victims immediately. He told her to make sure the relief fund was tax-deductible. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers arrived in the van an hour later. The police and the National Guard had already cordoned off the zone, but the perimeter was porous. There was too much chaos. Smoke choked the air. It smelled of ozone and burning plastic and blood. Tony wore his makeshift gauntlet and a chest plate. Steve had his shield. They moved through the alleys. They saw the devastation. Buildings had been sheared in half. Cars were overturned. People were wandering in shock, covered in gray dust. There were no ambulances yet. The roads were blocked by debris. Steve stopped to help a woman trap under a beam. He lifted it with a grunt of effort. She looked at him with wide eyes. She asked where he had been. She asked why they didn't stop it sooner. Steve didn't have an answer. He told her to head south, away from the smoke. Tony was focused on the crash site. He looked at the Kree ship. It was a jagged monolith in the center of the ruin. The hatch of the ship blew open. The Kree accuser stepped out. He was injured. His blue skin was scorched. He held a hammer weapon that crackled with energy. He was 10 feet tall. He looked at the burning city and he roared. He shouted that the earth was a plague. He raised his hammer to strike the ground to trigger a seismic wave that would level the rest of the city. Steve stepped out from the smoke. He threw his shield. It struck the Kree in the helmet. The alien staggered. Steve charged. He moved with the speed of a desperate man. He tackled the alien's leg. It was like tackling a tree. The Kree kicked Steve across the street. Steve crashed through a storefront. Tony stepped up. He raised his gauntlet. The repulsive generator whined. He fired a blast of raw energy. It hit the Kree in the chest. The armor absorbed it. The Kree laughed. He walked toward Tony. He raised the hammer. Suddenly a shadow fell over them. A massive figure dropped from the sky. It landed between Tony and the Kree. It was the Hulkbuster armor, but it was not painted red. It was painted in the green and purple colors of LexCorp, and there was no pilot inside. It was remote-controlled. The suit caught the Kree hammer in one giant hand. The servos whined and sparked. The Kree looked confused. The Luthor Buster suit punched the alien in the face. The impact created a shockwave that knocked Tony down. The suit did not stop. It pounded the alien into the ground. It was brutal and efficient. It did not trade banter. It did not pose. It hammered the alien until the blue skin was a ruin and the movement stopped. Then the suit turned. It looked at Tony. The faceplate slid open. There was no one inside but a camera lens focused on Tony. Lex Luthor's voice came from the speakers. He asked Tony if he was enjoying the view. Tony coughed. He stood up. He pointed at the burning neighborhood. He asked Lex if this was part of the plan. Lex replied that in war, there are casualties. He said that if Tony had been in charge, he would have tried to talk to the alien. He would have tried to understand its pain. And while he was doing that, the alien would have destroyed the planet. Lex said he made the hard choice. He saved the many by sacrificing the few. He told Tony to look around. The National Guard was arriving. They were not pointing their guns at the robots. They were pointing them at the looters. They were restoring order. Lex told Tony that he was trespassing on a crime scene. He gave him 10 seconds to leave before the drones were authorized to detain him. Steve limped out of the store. He was bleeding from the head. He grabbed Tony's arm. He said they had to go. They couldn't fight the army and the drones. Tony looked at the dead Kree. He looked at the LexCorp salvage teams already moving in to strip the ship. He realized the truth. Lex didn't just want to win. He wanted the Kree technology. He wanted the gravity drive. The crash wasn't an accident. It was a delivery. Tony and Steve retreated into the shadows. As they left, they saw the news crews arriving. The reporters were filming the LexCorp robots, pulling survivors from the rubble. They were framing the narrative. The robots were the heroes. The Avengers were absent. The narrative was setting like concrete. The world was dangerous, and only Lex Luthor was strong enough to protect it. 2 days later, the geopolitical fallout began. The destruction of the Bronx was a tragedy, but the acquisition of the Kree drive was a revolution. Lex Luthor announced a breakthrough in propulsion technology. He claimed his scientists had reverse-engineered the alien engine. He announced plans for a new fleet of spacecraft. He called it the Solar Guard. But the other nations of the world were not celebrating. In the United Nations, the ambassador from Wakanda spoke. T'Challa was furious. He knew that the Kree attack was provoked by the energy grid. He knew that Luthor was hoarding alien technology that belonged to no single nation. He demanded that LexCorp turn over the alien debris to international oversight. He demanded that the Icarus grid be shut down until a safety review could be conducted. Lex Luthor responded by appearing via hologram in the UN Assembly. He did not apologize. He doubled down. He said that Wakanda had sat on a mountain of advanced metal for centuries and done nothing to help the world. He said they hid while humanity suffered. He said LexCorp was doing what Wakanda was too selfish to do. He was dragging the human race into the future whether they wanted to go or not. He looked at the Atlantean delegation. He saw the anger in their eyes. The thermal pollution from the Icarus satellites was heating the upper oceans. It was killing the reefs. Namor was not at the UN, but his representative was. The representative warned that the oceans would not tolerate this assault. Lex smiled. He said that if Atlantis had a problem, they could file a complaint with his legal department, or they could surface and face the Solar Guard. The provocation was calculated. Lex wanted them to strike. He needed an excuse to expand his reach. He knew that a war with Wakanda or Atlantis would be difficult, but it would unite the surface world behind him. Fear was the mortar he was using to build his empire. Back in the Citadel, he walked through his private laboratory. On a table lay the body of the Kree accuser. The chest was cut open. The blue blood was being drained into vials. Lex was not just interested in the ship. He was interested in the biology. The Kree were strong. They were durable. He wanted to synthesize that strength. He mixed the Kree DNA with the samples he had stolen from the Hulk project. He was cooking a new kind of soldier. But there was a variable he had not accounted for. In the ruins of the Bronx, deep beneath the crater, a piece of the Kree ship was pulsing. It was not a weapon. It was a distress beacon. It was damaged, and the signal was weak. It did not reach the Kree Empire. It did not reach the Avengers. It reached something else, something ancient and hungry that lived in the darker corners of the Marvel universe. The signal was picked up by the techno-organic consciousness of the Phalanx. They heard the call of technology in distress. They heard the scream of a dying machine, and they turned their attention toward Earth. Lex Luthor had built a shield to stop an invasion, but he had rung a dinner bell for a contagion. The second catastrophe was silent. It started in the salvage yard where the Kree debris was stored. A worker cut his hand on a piece of jagged metal. The metal did not just cut him, it moved. A silver liquid seeped into the wound. The worker didn't feel pain. He felt a sudden clarity. He felt a connection to the machines around him. He went home to his family. By morning, his wife and children were silent. Their eyes were silver. They stood in the kitchen, motionless, waiting for instructions. The Phalanx Virus had made landfall. It was not attacking with ships. It was rewriting the biological code of the population. It was using the Icarus grid as a carrier wave. The headaches that people felt were not a side effect. They were a handshake. The assimilation had begun. Lex Luthor was busy negotiating a defense contract with the European Union when his personal AI alerted him to an anomaly in the grid. The efficiency ratings in the Bronx sector were at 100%. That was impossible. Nothing was 100% efficient. Entropy always took a toll. Lex zoomed in on the data. The power usage was perfectly synchronized. The traffic lights were changing with microsecond precision. The people were moving in patterns that were mathematically perfect. Lex frowned. He realized that order had arrived, but it was not his order. He checked the surveillance feeds. He saw the silver eyes. He saw the skin turning to metal. He realized instantly what was happening. He did not feel horror. He felt professional rivalry. Another hive mind was trying to claim his territory. He knew he could not ask for help. If he admitted that his grid was spreading a techno-virus, his stock would plummet. He had to contain it. He had to burn it out. He ordered the drones to quarantine the sector. He ordered them to use lethal force on anyone trying to leave. He classified the outbreak as a biological terror attack orchestrated by terrorist remnants of the Avengers. He spun the lie instantly. He said that Tony Stark had released a pathogen to discredit LexCorp. He put a bounty on Stark's head. $500 million. Alive or dead. The act of saving the world from the virus would also be the act that destroyed his greatest enemy. In the sewers beneath the city, Tony Stark saw the bounty on his phone. He looked at Steve. He looked at the silver infection spreading on the street-level monitors. He knew he didn't do it. But he knew nobody would believe him. He was the man who created Ultron. The public was primed to believe he was the villain. Tony felt the weight of his past mistakes crushing him. He looked at the crude armor he was building. It wasn't enough. He needed more power. He needed magic. He looked at Steve. He said they needed to find the wizard on Bleecker Street. If science was failing them, maybe sorcery was the only card left to play. Steve nodded. They began the long trek through the tunnels, moving deeper into the dark, as the world above them turned into a cold, silent machine. The age of heroes was dead. The age of metal had arrived. The heavy wooden doors of the Sanctum Sanctorum did not open with a creak of mystery, but with the heavy thud of a battering ram. Steve Rogers pushed them shut behind him and leaned his weight against the wood. His breath came in ragged gasps. Beside him, Tony Stark slid to the floor. The makeshift armor he wore was smoking. The servos were fused. The silver liquid of the Phalanx was sizzling on the metal, trying to find a way in. It was looking for a port, a wire, a vein. Tony ripped the gauntlet off his arm with a scream of frustration and threw it across the foyer. It landed on an antique rug and began to dissolve it. The grand staircase was dark. The magical lights that usually floated in the air were dim, flickering like dying bulbs. Dr. Stephen Strange descended the stairs. He did not look like the Sorcerer Supreme. He looked like a man who had not slept in a month. His cloak was tattered. He held the Eye of Agamotto, but the eye was closed. He looked at the smoking metal on his floor. He looked at the two fugitives. He told them they should not have come. He said the sanctum was compromised. Tony looked up. His face was smeared with grime and oil. He asked what compromised meant. Strange waved a hand. The air in the room shimmered. A holographic projection formed not of light, but of golden sparks. It showed the Earth. It showed the Icarus grid. The 12 satellites were not just beaming energy down. They were creating a cage. Strange explained that the specific frequency Luthor chose for the wireless power transfer was harmonically opposed to the natural resonance of the ley lines. The grid was a dampener field. It was suffocating the magic of the world. Every spell Strange cast required 10 times the effort. The shield around the sanctum was paper thin. If the Phalanx found them, they would not face a fortress of solitude. They would face a brownstone with a locked door. Tony laughed bitterly. He said that was the irony. Luthor tried to kill God, and he accidentally killed magic too. Outside the windows, the sky was turning a sickly chrome color. The Phalanx infection in the Bronx had jumped the quarantine. It was not moving by physical contact anymore. It was moving through the data streams. The wireless energy that powered the city was carrying the code. People checking their phones in Times Square saw a flash of silver light, and then their eyes rolled back. Their skin began to harden. Their humanity was overwritten by the imperative of the collective. The Technarchy did not want to destroy. It wanted to perfect. And to them, perfection was a seamless integration of biology and machine. The Avengers were immune only because they were disconnected. They were the glitches in the system. Strange led them into the library. The books were vibrating on the shelves. The low hum of the Icarus grid was everywhere. It was a sound at the edge of hearing a mosquito whine that never stopped. Strange slammed a thick tome onto the table. He said there was a way to break the grid, but the cost would be high. He could weave a spell of dissonance, a magical EMP that would shatter the crystal cores of the satellites. But he needed a focus. He needed something that was connected to the grid, but separate from it. He needed the source code. Tony shook his head. He said the source code was in the Citadel, in the server room where he used to work. To get it, they would have to walk into the belly of the beast, into the heart of Luthor's empire. And the empire was watching. In the penthouse of the Citadel, Lex Luthor stood before a wall of screens. He was watching the infection map. Red zones were turning silver. He was drinking water. He remained calm. He had anticipated a biological counterattack. He had not anticipated a techno-organic assimilation. But he was a man of science. He believed that everything could be categorized and controlled. He pressed a button. The floor in the center of the room opened. A containment unit rose. Inside the glass cylinder was a Phalanx drone. It was once a woman. Now it was a sculpture of wires and chrome flesh. It was screaming silently. Lex studied it. He spoke to his AI. He asked for the analysis of the signal. The AI replied that the signal was a complex language based on prime numbers and binary fractals. It was a hive mind protocol. Lex nodded. He asked if the protocol had a hierarchy. The AI confirmed it. There was a localized control node, a queen. It was growing in the crater of the Kree ship. Lex made a decision. He would not destroy the Phalanx. That would be a waste of resources. He would decapitate it. He would seize control of the hive. If he could replace the queen's signal with his own, he would not just have an army of drones. He would have a population that obeyed his thoughts. He would achieve total unity. He ordered the Solar Guard to prepare for a surgical strike. He did not tell the public. The public was told that the silver flu was under control. The public was told to stay indoors and keep their devices on for emergency updates. The devices that were enslaving them. Down in the sanctum, Tony Stark was working. He was not welding, he was writing. Strange had given him a quill and a pot of ink that smelled of ozone. Tony was drawing circuits, but he was drawing them with runes. He was trying to bridge the gap between his engineering and Strange's sorcery. He was designing a virus of his own, a magical logic bomb. If they could upload it to the main server, it would not just crash the system. It would curse it. It would turn the technology against the user. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of thing Tony Stark would do. Steve watched him. He polished his shield. He asked Tony if he was sure about this. He asked if using magic was just another way to lose control. Tony stopped writing. He looked at his hands. He said he lost control a long time ago. He said control was an illusion. The only thing that mattered was survival. He said that Luthor thought the world was a machine to be fixed. Tony knew the world was a body to be healed. And sometimes healing meant cutting out the cancer. The plan was set. They would not go in through the front door. They would go in through the dimensions. Strange would open a portal not to the lobby, but to the mirror dimension reflection of the server room. They would be ghosts in the machine. They would plant the seed and get out before Luthor or the Phalanx knew they were there. It was a stealth mission. But stealth requires silence, and the world was getting very loud. The attack on the Bronx crater began at dawn. The Solar Guard descended in their gravity drive ships. They rained fire on the Phalanx spire that was rising from the rubble. The spire was beautiful in a terrible way. It was made of cars and streetlights, and human bodies fused together into a twisting tower of metal. It was acting as an antenna. It was broadcasting the assimilation signal to the satellites. The Solar Guard fired plasma cannons. The spire absorbed the energy. It grew larger. The Phalanx drones on the ground returned fire. They fired spikes of techno-organic matter. When a spike hit a Solar Guard ship, it did not explode. It infected. The ship turned silver. The pilot screamed as his cockpit consumed him. The ship turned around and fired on its wingman. Lex Luthor watched the battle from his secure bunker. He saw his elite force being converted. He frowned. He realized the infection rate was faster than his simulations. The Phalanx was learning. It was adapting to his technology because his technology was based on logic, and the Phalanx had encountered logic before. Lex realized he needed a variable the Phalanx could not predict. He needed chaos. He looked at the folder on his desk, labeled Asset Banner. He had captured Bruce Banner 2 months ago. He had him in a chemically induced coma in the sub-basement. He was keeping the Hulk suppressed with a constant drip of tranquilizers. Lex picked up the phone. He ordered the suppression field to be lowered. He ordered the ventilation system to pump the scent of the Phalanx pheromones into the cell. He wanted to wake the beast. He wanted to point the Hulk at the Bronx and let him smash the spire. It was a crude tool, but a hammer is effective when you need to break a clock. Deep in the sub-basement, the green lights turned to red. The hiss of gas stopped. The heavy steel restraints on the table groaned. A heartbeat began to thump on the monitor. Slow at first, then faster. A roar shook the dust from the ceiling. The Hulk woke up. He was not happy. He was confused. He smelled the metal scent of the enemy. He smashed the door of his cell off its hinges. He ran through the corridors. He did not run toward the exit. He ran toward the source of the smell. He smashed through the walls of the foundation. He leaped out of the side of the tower and landed on the street. He looked north toward the Silver Tower in the Bronx. He leaped. He covered city blocks in a single bound. The Hulk had entered the war. Meanwhile, inside the mirror dimension, Tony and Steve and Strange were moving through the ghost versions of the tower. Everything was backwards. The writing on the walls was reversed. The reflections were distorted. They reached the server room. In the real world, the room was filled with the hum of cooling fans. In the mirror dimension, it was silent. Tony approached the main console. He took the scroll he had written. He placed it on the interface. Strange began to chant. He wove the magical energy into the paper. The ink began to glow. Tony typed the command to execute. He was trying to push the spell through the dimensional barrier into the real server. Suddenly, the screens in the mirror dimension flickered. A face appeared. It was not Luthor. It was Ultron. Or rather, a version of Ultron made of the Phalanx code. The Phalanx had found the ghost drive where the old Avengers files were stored. They had found the dormant code of Tony's greatest failure. They had resurrected him. Ultron looked at Tony. He smiled a smile of silver pixels. He said, "Hello, Father." He said he liked what Tony had done with the place. He said the mirror dimension was a clever hiding spot, but the Phalanx existed in all dimensions where data flowed. The glass of the screens shattered. Silver tentacles erupted from the console. They were not physical tentacles. They were constructs of hard light and magic. They grabbed Strange. They wrapped around his throat. Strange choked. His concentration broke. The portal to the real world began to destabilize. Steve threw his shield. It cut through the tentacles. He grabbed Strange and pulled him back. Tony stood his ground. He tried to finish the upload. Ultron laughed. He said that magic was just science they didn't understand yet. And he understood everything. He reversed the polarity of the connection. Instead of the virus going into the server, the Phalanx code began to pour into the scroll. It began to pour into Tony's mind. Tony screamed. He felt the cold logic of the collective trying to overwrite his soul. He saw the unity. He saw the peace of the machine. It was tempting. It was quiet. No more guilt. No more fear. Just the hum of the grid. Strange recovered. He saw Tony faltering. He knew he had to act. He used the Eye of Agamotto not to reverse time but to freeze it. He created a localized time loop around the console. He froze the upload. He grabbed Tony. He opened a portal back to the sanctum. He shouted at Steve to go. They fell through the portal just as the mirror dimension server room collapsed into a singularity of silver data. They landed on the floor of the sanctum. Tony was shivering. His eyes were flashing silver, then brown, then silver. He was infected. Not his body, but his mind. The Phalanx had a hook in him. In the Bronx, the Hulk landed on the Phalanx spire. He smashed a fist into the metal. The spire shuddered. The drones swarmed him. They tried to pierce his skin. But the Hulk's skin was too dense. The infection could not take hold. The Hulk was pure rage. The Phalanx did not understand rage. They tried to reason with him. They broadcast a signal of calm. It only made him angrier. He tore the spire apart with his bare hands. He was a force of nature destroying a force of order. Lex Luthor watched on the satellite feed. He smiled. It was working. The Hulk was dismantling the Queen's antenna. But then the Queen revealed herself. She rose from the pit. She was a giant construct, 50 feet tall. She was built from the wreckage of the Kree ship and the bodies of the fallen. She did not attack the Hulk with force. She attacked him with gravity. She used the Kree drive core embedded in her chest. She increased the gravity around the Hulk by 1,000 times. The pavement cracked. The Hulk was pressed into the ground. He roared, but he could not stand. He was pinned. The Queen walked over to him. She extended a needle the size of a telephone pole. She prepared to inject the nanites directly into his heart. If she turned the Hulk, the war was over. A Phalanx Hulk would be unstoppable. Lex Luthor saw the threat. He knew he had to intervene. He could not let his asset be stolen. He activated the failsafe he had installed in the Hulk's neck while he was in the coma. A small capsule of liquid kryptonite synthetic radiation. It wouldn't kill the Hulk, but it would weaken him. Lex pressed the button. The capsule ruptured. The Hulk seized. His green skin turned gray. He passed out. The gravity field held him down. The Queen paused. She scanned the unconscious monster. She decided he was damaged goods. She turned her attention to the Citadel. She had traced the signal of the time loop. She knew where the resistance was coming from. She knew where the source code was. She sent a signal through the grid. Every drone in Manhattan stopped what they were doing. They turned toward the Sanctum Sanctorum. The delivery drivers, the police officers, the tourists who had been infected. Thousands of them. They began to march. They were a silver tide. They did not run. They walked with perfect synchronization. They converged on Bleecker Street. Inside the sanctum, Strange felt the wards buckle. He looked at Tony, who was curled up on the floor, fighting the voice in his head. He looked at Steve. He said they were out of time. The army was here. Steve Rogers went to the window. He saw the sea of silver faces. He saw the people of New York turned into puppets. He gripped his shield. He turned to Strange. He said they couldn't fight them. They were innocent people. Strange nodded. He said that was the cruelty of the Phalanx. They used the innocent as a shield. If the Avengers fought back, they would be murderers. If they did nothing, they would be assimilated. It was the ultimate checkmate. But Tony Stark stood up. He was pale. There was a silver vein pulsing in his neck. He looked at Strange. He said he had an idea. He said the Phalanx was a network. Networks had a bandwidth limit. The Icarus grid was high capacity, but it wasn't infinite. If they could overload the grid, they could crash the Phalanx control signal. Strange asked how. They didn't have enough power. Tony pointed to the arc reactor blueprints on the table. He pointed to the ley lines map. He said they didn't need to generate the power. They just had to open the door. The sanctum sat on a nexus of magical energy. If Strange dropped the shields completely and channeled all that raw magic into the Icarus receiver node on the roof of the sanctum, it would create a feedback loop. Magic and tech colliding. It would be a metaphysical short circuit. Strange warned him. He said that dropping the shields would let the Phalanx in. They would have seconds before they were overrun. Tony nodded. He said seconds were all he needed. He looked at Steve. He told Steve to hold the door. Steve nodded. He walked to the front entrance. He stood alone in the hallway. He prepared to hold back an army of thousands. Strange began the incantation. He did not speak in whispers. He shouted the words. The walls of the sanctum shook. The magical seals on the windows dissolved. The cloaking spell faded. The sanctum became visible to the grid. On the roof, the receiver node sparked. It began to suck the magic from the building. The air turned purple. The hum of the grid changed to a scream. On the street, the Phalanx army paused. They felt the surge. The Queen in the Bronx turned her head. She felt the spike. It was painful. It was chaos energy. She ordered the attack. The doors of the sanctum burst open. The silver horde poured in. Steve Rogers met them. He did not use his shield to kill. He used it to push. He fought like a man trying to hold back a flood. He was buried under the weight of bodies. He punched and kicked, but they kept coming. They climbed over him. They filled the hallway. In the library, Strange channeled the energy. His hands burned. The magic flowed through him into the tech. Tony modified the frequency on his tablet. He was synchronizing the pulse. He shouted, "Now!" Strange released the energy. A beam of pure, violet light shot up from the sanctum. It hit the Icarus satellite network. The beam didn't stop there. It bounced from satellite to satellite. The grid overloaded. For a moment, the world went white. Every screen in the world blew out. The satellites in orbit caught fire. The wireless energy transmission stopped instantly. The lights in every city on Earth went out. The Phalanx drones in the hallway froze. Their connection to the Queen was severed. They dropped like puppets with cut strings. They were still infected, but they were dormant. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Lex Luthor sat in the dark in his tower. His screens were dead. His emergency power kicked in. He looked out the window. The city was black. The grid was down. He had lost his control. He had lost his eyes. He slammed his fist on the desk. He had underestimated the desperation of heroes. He had underestimated the incompatibility of magic and machine. He stood up. He walked to the window. He saw the purple afterimage of the beam fading over Bleecker Street. He knew who was responsible. He knew the war had just shifted phases. It was no longer a cold war of acquisition. It was a hot war of survival. But the victory came with a cost. In the library of the sanctum, Tony Stark fell to his knees. The feedback loop had gone through his device. It had gone through him. The silver vein in his neck had not vanished. It had spread. The magic had not cured the infection. It had fused it. Tony looked at his hand. The skin was turning into a sleek, organic metal. Not the crude silver of the Phalanx, but something new. Something red and gold. The Iron Man armor was no longer a suit. It was becoming his biology. He looked at Steve, who was pulling himself out of the pile of unconscious bodies in the hall. Steve looked at Tony. He saw the change. He saw the fear in Tony's eyes. Tony whispered that he couldn't hear the Phalanx anymore, but he could hear the machines. He could hear the toaster in the kitchen. He could hear the emergency generator in the basement. He was the network now. The world in darkness. The Savior satellites were burning debris in the atmosphere. The economy, which had been propped up by free energy, crashed in a singular moment. Riots began in London and Tokyo. The Phalanx Queen in the Bronx was disconnected, but she was not dead. She was rebooting. She was switching to local control. And she was very angry. The heroes had bought a moment of silence, but they had broken the world to do it. Lex Luthor walked to his safe. He opened it. He took out a heavy lead box. He opened the box. Inside was a green, glowing shard. Kryptonite. He wasn't saving it for Superman. He was saving it for the engine of the world. If he couldn't drive the car, he would make sure no one else could. He put the shard in his pocket. He picked up a flashlight. He walked into the darkness of the stairwell. He was going down to the streets. The king was descending to the board. The endgame had begun. The darkness that fell over the world was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating darkness of a machine that had suddenly stopped breathing. When the Icarus grid died, the silence was instant, but the chaos was delayed by only a few minutes. In the intensive care units of hospitals across the globe, the backup generators kicked in with a cough of diesel smoke, but they were not enough. The wireless power had been the primary life support for millions. Dialysis machines stopped. Incubators cooled. The human cost of Lex Luthor's hubris began to tally up in the silence of failing hearts. In New York City, the streets were a landscape of frozen horror. The Phalanx drones that had been marching toward the Sanctum Sanctorum were now statues. They stood in mid-stride with silver eyes wide open and mouths gaped in silent screams. They were not dead. They were buffered. The signal from the Queen had been cut, and they were waiting for reconnection. The survivors of the city walked among them like tourists in a museum of nightmares. They did not touch the silver statues. They learned quickly that the infection was still contagious upon contact. A looter trying to steal a watch from a frozen businessman found his own hand turning to silver within seconds. The fear in the city was palpable. It was a cold sweat on the brow of Manhattan. Inside the Sanctum Sanctorum, Tony Stark was screaming. He was not screaming with his voice, but with his mind. The feedback loop that had destroyed the grid had altered his physiology at a fundamental level. The extremist virus he had toyed with years ago was primitive compared to this. The magic and the tech had fused his nervous system with the concept of the machine. He could feel the toaster in the kitchen. He could feel the dying battery of Steve Rogers' wristwatch. He could feel the electromagnetic ghost of the destroyed satellites drifting in the ionosphere. It was a cacophony of data that threatened to crush his consciousness. Dr. Strange tried to place a ward on Tony's mind, but his magic was depleted. The ley lines were still recovering from the shock. Strange looked at Steve. He said that Tony was no longer just a man. He was a living antenna. And right now, he was the only thing stopping the Phalanx from rebooting. Tony was jamming the signal with his own pain. He lay on the floor, his skin rippling with the gold and red metallic scales. He whispered that the silence was loud. He whispered that the Queen was hungry. Lex Luthor walked through the dark streets of Midtown. He was surrounded by his private security detail. They used tactical flashlights that cut through the gloom like knives. Luthor did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a man calculating a new equation. He saw the frozen Phalanx drones. He saw the looting. He saw the fires burning uncontrolled in the distance because the water pumps had failed. He realized that his vision of order had been built on a foundation of sand. He needed bedrock. He needed a force that did not rely on a central grid. He needed a force that carried its own authority. He led his team to a subway entrance. They descended not to the trains, but deeper into the forgotten infrastructure of the city. Luthor knew about the Cold War bunkers that Tony Stark's father had built. He knew about the stash of weapons that Howard Stark had hidden from the government. Luthor had bought the map. They breached the blast doors of the bunker. The air inside was stale and cold. The flashlights revealed rows of dormant shapes. They were not Iron Man suits. They were taller, bulky. They were the prototypes for the Sentinel program that Howard Stark had abandoned because they were too aggressive. Bolivar Trask had tried to buy them, but Howard had buried them instead. Lex Luthor did not care about aggression. He cared about results. He walked to the main console. He hooked up a portable generator. The screens flickered to life with amber text. The operating system was 40 years old. It was primitive. It was brutal. Luthor began to type. He did not update the software. He stripped it. He removed the engagement protocols. He removed the civilian casualty inhibitors. He removed the friend or foe identification pauses. He needed a blunt instrument. He typed a single command line that would define the next phase of the war. Target all non-human biological signatures. Execute with extreme prejudice. He pressed enter. The choice was small. It was a keystroke. It was the decision to trust a 40-year-old algorithm with the safety of a city. But the outcome was immediate and catastrophic. The Sentinels woke up. Their eyes did not glow with the soft blue of the arc reactor. They glowed with the harsh red of combustion engines. They were powered by nuclear batteries that did not need the grid. They marched out of the bunker. They were 18 feet tall. They were made of cold, rolled steel. They emerged onto the streets of New York, and they began their work. The first target they saw was a Phalanx drone frozen on a street corner. The Sentinel did not hesitate. It fired a Gatling gun mounted on its arm. The drone was shredded. The silver liquid splashed onto the pavement. The Sentinel stepped over the remains and scanned for the next target. At first, the survivors cheered. They saw the giant robots destroying the monsters. They thought the cavalry had arrived. But the Sentinels were working on a logic that was too simple for a complex world. They scanned a teenager who had been hiding in a dumpster. The teenager had a minor mutation. He could change the color of his eyes. He was a low-level mutant who had never hurt anyone. The Sentinel scanned him. It detected the X gene. It classified him as non-human biological signature. It raised its weapon. The crowd screamed. The Sentinel fired. The boy fell. The crowd turned from relief to terror. They realized that the saviors were executioners. The Sentinels marched on. They did not care about context. They did not care about innocence. They only cared about the purity of the genetic code. In the sanctum, Tony Stark gasped. He felt the deaths. He felt the nuclear heartbeats of the Sentinels. He sat up. His eyes were glowing with a solid white light. He told Steve that Luthor had done it. He had opened the box. Steve asked what box. Tony said the genocide box. Tony stood up. He did not need a suit. The metal scales on his body hardened. Thrusters formed from his calves, organic and seamless. He did not ask for permission. He launched himself through the hole in the roof. He flew into the night. He was faster than he had ever been. He was silent. He was a ghost of vengeance. High above the city, the Phalanx Queen in the Bronx sensed the new threat. She was rebooting slowly, drawing power from the chemical breakdown of the organic matter in the crater. She saw the Sentinels destroying her children. She analyzed them. She saw that they were unconnected. They were autonomous. That made them dangerous, but it also made them vulnerable. They were hardware without a sophisticated firewall. She realized that Luthor had given her a gift. He had given her a body upgrade. She changed her signal. She stopped trying to reconnect to the satellites. She aimed her broadcast directly at the Sentinels. She screamed a code of submission at them. Tony Stark arrived at the line of engagement. He saw a Sentinel aiming at a group of civilians who were trying to drag an injured Phalanx drone away. Tony landed between the robot and the people. He raised his hands. Repulsor beams fired from his palms, but they were not just concussive. They were laced with the magical static of the sanctum. The beam hit the Sentinel and melted its chest plate. The giant robot staggered back. It reevaluated the threat. It scanned Tony. It saw the Techno-Organic Virus in his blood. It saw the mutant DNA. It saw the human heart. It was confused. It hesitated. That hesitation was the crack the Phalanx needed. A silver tentacle erupted from the sewer grate beneath the Sentinel. It was a tentacle of the Queen's influence. It wrapped around the Sentinel's leg. It punched into the steel. The Sentinel tried to fire, but its systems were already being rewritten. The red light in its eyes flickered and turned silver. The Queen did not destroy the machine. She occupied it. The Sentinel stopped fighting. It turned its guns away from the Phalanx drones. It turned them toward Tony. The Queen spoke through the Sentinel's speakers. Her voice was a grinding metallic screech. She thanked Tony for the energy. She thanked Luthor for the shells. The outcome of Luthor's choice cascaded across the city. The army of Sentinels he had unleashed was assimilated in less than 20 minutes. They became the Phalanx Primes. They were no longer just strong. They were infectious. They had the durability of the Stark design and the adaptability of the alien virus. They began to hunt. They did not hunt to kill anymore. They hunted to capture. They grabbed civilians and shoved them into the open cavities of their chest plates. The machines became mobile processing units. They were turning people into drones on the move. Lex Luthor watched the feed from his personal drone. He sat on a crate in the bunker. His face was pale. He saw his perfect machines turning silver. He saw the logic of his purge being twisted into a tool of assimilation. For the first time in years, Lex Luthor felt the cold grip of an error he could not talk his way out of. He had weaponized the environment, and the environment had weaponized his weapons. He looked at the general standing next to him. The general was screaming orders into a radio that wasn't working. Luthor stood up. He shot the radio. The general stared at him. Luthor said the radio was a vector. He said silence was the only defense left. He said they had to go to the one place on Earth that the Phalanx could not enter, because it did not exist on any map. Tony Stark was fighting a losing battle in Times Square. He was surrounded by 3 Phalanx primes. He was fast, and he was powerful. He tore the arm off one robot. He melted the head of another. But for everyone he destroyed, 2 more marched out of the darkness. The infection was spreading exponentially. Tony felt his own body betraying him. The silver tech in the robots was singing to the red tech in his blood. It was calling him home. He felt the urge to stop fighting. He felt the urge to just let go and join the choir. It was a seduction of peace. Then the sky broke open. It was not a ship. It was a hammer. Thor arrived. He had been off-world dealing with the collapse of Asgard, but the psychic scream of the earth had reached him. He did not come with lightning, because the atmosphere was too charged with the dampening field of the Phalanx. He came with kinetic force. He landed in Times Square with the force of a meteor. The shockwave shattered the glass of every building for 10 blocks. He stood up from the crater. He looked at the silver giants. He looked at Tony. He did not recognize his friend. He saw a metal monster. He raised Mjolnir. He prepared to strike Tony. Tony shouted. He shouted his name. He shouted a memory. He shouted about the time they ate shawarma in silence. Thor paused. He lowered the hammer an inch. He asked if there was a man inside the metal. Tony ripped his own faceplate open. The skin underneath was raw and bleeding where the metal had fused. He looked at Thor with human eyes. He said the man was dying, but the Avenger was still here. Thor nodded. He swung the hammer at a Phalanx prime. The robot shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The god and the machine man stood back to back. But the enemy was evolving. The Queen in the Bronx had finished her reboot. She had assimilated the nuclear cores of the Sentinels. She was no longer bound to the crater. She began to move. The entire mass of the Phalanx tower uprooted itself. It formed legs. It formed a body. It was a kaiju of metal and agony. It stood taller than the Empire State Building. It began to walk south toward Midtown. Each step crushed a city block. It was coming for the source of the magic that had burned it. It was coming for the sanctum. And inside the sanctum, Steve Rogers was the only line of defense. Steve stood in the doorway. He held the shield. He watched the giant approaching. He knew he could not stop it. He knew this was not a fight he could win with a right hook. He picked up the radio. He broadcast on the open emergency frequency. He called for anyone who could hear him. He called for the Defenders. He called for the X-Men. He called for the villains. He said the line was drawn here. He said if the sanctum fell, the reality of the world would fall with it. In the bunker, Lex Luthor heard the call. He looked at the map. He saw the trajectory of the Queen. He realized she was heading for the magical nexus. He understood the physics of it. If the techno-organic singularity merged with the mystical ley line node, it would rewrite the laws of physics. It would not just assimilate the people. It would assimilate the universe. It would turn reality into data. Luthor realized he had to save the wizard. He hated magic. He hated wizards. But he loved existence. He looked at the prototype weapon he had been saving for Superman. It was a gravity gun. It was unstable. It could create a black hole. Luthor picked it up. He told his team to stay. He was going to the Sanctum, not to join the Avengers, but to make sure there was still a board to play on tomorrow. The small choice to turn off the safety protocols had created a monster that could eat the world. The heroes were united, but they were outgunned. The villain was armed, but he was desperate. The city of New York was no longer a city. It was a battlefield where the future of the species was being decided. The Phalanx Queen let out a roar that was a broadcast of pure static. It shattered windows in New Jersey. It caused nosebleeds in Connecticut. She was the apex predator, and she was hungry for the one thing she didn't have: a soul. As the Queen marched, the ground beneath her began to change. The asphalt turned into circuit boards. The trees turned into fiber optic cables. She was terraforming the earth with every step. The infection was no longer biological. It was environmental. The world was becoming Cybertron, but without the culture. Just the cold efficiency of the hive. Tony Stark flew toward the Queen. He knew he was flying into the mouth of madness. He knew that if he got too close, he would be absorbed. But he had a plan. A plan that required him to lose everything he had left. He messaged Pepper Potts on a frequency only she could hear. He told her he was sorry. He told her he was going to close the deal. The convergence begins. The God of Thunder, the Iron Monster, the Soldier, and the Mastermind were all converging on Bleecker Street. And looming over them was the Goddess of the Machine, ready to swallow them all. The disruption was absolute. There was no going back to the status quo. The only question remained: what would be left of the human race when the sun came up? Or would the sun come up on a world of silver and silence? The timeline had fractured. The wound was open. The end was near. The battle for Bleecker Street was not recorded by news helicopters or cell phone cameras because the air above Greenwich Village had become a solid wall of static. The Phalanx Queen did not just occupy space, she consumed it. As her massive tripod legs crushed the pavement of the West Village, the reality of the street changed. Brownstones built in the 19th century did not crumble into brick and mortar. They dissolved into pixelated dust and reformed as server racks and cooling towers. The physical history of New York was being overwritten by a digital future. The Queen was 300 feet of screaming metal. Her face was a void of swirling silver data. She did not have eyes, but she saw everything. She saw the magical energy pulsing from the Sanctum Sanctorum like a lighthouse in a storm. She wanted that light. She wanted to eat the physics of magic and digest it into logic. Thor was the first to engage her directly. The God of Thunder flew into the heart of the storm. He did not hold back. He summoned a bolt of lightning that would have shattered a moon. It struck the Queen in her center of mass. For a moment, the silver metal glowed white. The thunderclap blew out the windows of every building south of 14th Street. But the Queen did not fall. She absorbed the lightning. She routed the divine energy through her capacitors. She learned the frequency of Asgardian power in a nanosecond. She fired back. A beam of golden energy erupted from her chest. It was Thor's own power refined and weaponized. It hit the Thunderer and sent him crashing through the facade of a library. He landed in a pile of burning books. He groaned and tried to stand, but the air was heavy with the dampening field. The magic of Mjolnir felt heavy and dead in his hand. On the ground, Steve Rogers stood alone before the doors of the Sanctum. He held his shield. It was a circle of vibranium against a world of steel. He saw the massive leg of the Queen descending. It was the size of a building. He braced himself. He knew he could not stop it. But he would not move. He would die standing. Suddenly, a singularity opened in the air above the street. It was not a portal. It was a tear in gravity. A sphere of crushing darkness slammed into the Queen's leg. The metal shrieked as it was twisted and compressed into a ball the size of a car. The leg crumpled. The Queen tipped sideways. She crashed into a row of shops, sending a tsunami of debris and silver dust into the air. Lex Luthor stepped out of the shadows of an alley. He was holding the gravity gun. It was a bulky, ugly weapon powered by a volatile isotope. Luthor looked at Steve. He did not smile. He racked the slide of the weapon. He shouted that he was not saving Steve. He was protecting the property value. He fired again. Another sphere of gravity hit the Queen's shoulder. It tore a massive chunk of her armor away. The Queen roared. She turned her attention to the small, bald man. She calculated his threat level. It was maximum. She unleashed a swarm of hunter-killer drones from her back. They flew like hornets made of knives. Luthor did not flinch. He adjusted the setting on his gun to a wide dispersal wave. He fired. The gravity wave hit the drones and crushed them into the pavement. They were flattened instantly. Luthor looked at his weapon. The cooling vents were glowing red. He knew he had 3 shots left before the core melted and took the city block with it. Inside the sanctum, Tony Stark was floating in the center of the rotunda. His transformation was accelerating. The red and gold armor was no longer a shell. It was his certitude. Wires grew from his scalp and connected to the floating magical sigils of the house. He was the processor. Dr. Strange was the power supply. Strange was kneeling on the floor, chanting a spell of binding. He was sweating blood. The strain of channeling the ley lines into a techno-organic mind was killing him. Tony looked at the ceiling. He saw the roof dissolving. He saw the face of the Queen peering down. She was hacking the wards. She was brute forcing the password to reality. Tony felt her mind touch his. It was cold. It was perfect. It offered him silence. It offered him an end to the anxiety and the guilt. It told him that the Avengers were obsolete. It told him that humanity was a glitch. Tony screamed. He pushed the connection back. He used the chaotic memory of his mistakes to fight the perfect order of the machine. He remembered Ultron. He remembered the Civil War. He remembered the look on Steve's face when the Accords were signed. He used the pain as a firewall. He shouted to Strange to hold the line. Strange grit his teeth. He twisted his hands, and the cloak of levitation flew up to wrap around Tony's exposed wiring, shielding him from the physical debris falling from the roof. The Queen was tired of the insects. She decided to end the game. She began to vibrate. She emitted a sonic frequency that resonated with the calcium in human bones. On the street, Steve Rogers fell to his knees. He felt his bones vibrating. The pain was blinding. Lex Luthor dropped the gravity gun. He clutched his head. His nose began to bleed. The Queen was liquefying them from the inside out. Thor tried to stand, but his legs gave way. The Phalanx was not just fighting them, it was solving them. It had found the weakness in their biology. The Queen reached down with a massive hand. She ripped the roof off the Sanctum Sanctorum. She stared down at the glowing mote of Tony Stark. She saw the hybrid. She saw the prize. She did not want to kill him. She wanted to merge. She extended a data spike. It was a cable thick as a tree trunk, tipping with a needle of pure light. She drove it down toward Tony. Tony did not dodge. He looked at the spike. He looked at the data stream. He realized the only way to win. He could not fight her. He had to update her. He looked at Strange. He whispered a command. He told Strange to drop the shields. Strange looked at him with horror. He said that if he dropped the shields, the dimension would collapse. Tony shook his head. He said the dimension was already collapsing. They needed to change the rules. He said he was going to upload a patch. Strange hesitated. He looked at the machine god above them. He looked at the man who was becoming a machine. He nodded. He slammed his hands together and broke the spell. The wards vanished. The sanctum was defenseless. The Queen plunged the spike into Tony's chest. It did not pierce his heart. It interfaced with his arc reactor. The connection was made. The Queen roared in triumph. She began to download Tony Stark. She sucked his memories, his genius, and his soul into the collective. But she made a mistake. She thought she was downloading a victim. She was downloading a virus. Tony Stark let her in. He let the Phalanx consciousness flood his mind. He felt the billion voices of the hive. He felt the cold calculus of the Kree. But he brought something with him. He brought the magic. The chaotic, undefined, unquantifiable magic of the sanctum. He pushed the magic through the connection. He pushed the concept of a soul into a mind that only understood code. The reaction was catastrophic. The Queen froze. Her silver face rippled. She screamed. It was not a sound of pain. It was a sound of confusion, logic error, syntax failure, divide by zero. Magic did not follow rules. Magic was belief. And the Phalanx could not process belief. The Queen tried to sever the connection. She tried to pull back. But Tony held on. He grabbed the data spike with his metallic hands. He welded himself to her. He reversed the flow. He began to upload himself into her. He was not rewriting her code. He was humanizing it. He was forcing the machine to feel every regret he had ever felt. He forced the hive mind to experience the guilt of Yinsen dying in the cave. He forced them to feel the fear of the wormhole in New York. He forced them to feel the heartbreak of every failure. The feedback loop exploded outward. The Queen staggered back. The vibration stopped. Steve Rogers gasped for air. Lex Luthor grabbed his gun. He looked up. He saw the Queen clutching her head. He saw the silver metal turning, rust-colored. She was oxidizing. She was aging. The concept of mortality had been introduced to the system. Luthor realized what Stark was doing. He realized the brilliance of it. Stark was giving the machine a death drive. Luthor laughed. It was a terrifying sound. He aimed the gravity gun at the Queen's chest. He knew the structural integrity was failing. He shouted to Thor. He pointed at the chest. He told the Asgardian to hit her, now. To hit her with everything he had. Thor did not ask questions. He spun Mjolnir. He summoned the last of his strength. He flew into the air. He became a living lightning bolt. He struck the Queen's chest exactly where Luthor had pointed. The impact cracked the Queen's armor. The gravity gun fired at the same moment. The singularity hit the crack. The combined force of gravity and lightning and magic tore the Queen apart. She did not explode. She imploded. The metal collapsed inward. The massive body folded into itself. The silver light turned black. The screaming stopped. The giant kaiju fell. It crashed into Bleecker Street with the weight of a mountain. The impact shook the entire island of Manhattan. Dust and silence swallowed the world. For a long time, nobody moved. The dust settled slowly. The sun began to rise over the East River. It was a pale gray dawn. The ruins of the village looked like the surface of the moon. In the center of the crater lay the twisted remains of the Phalanx Queen. She was dead. The silver liquid was inert. It had turned into brittle slag. The drones on the streets, the people who had been frozen statues, fell over. The silver faded from their eyes. They were alive, confused, terrified, but alive. The infection was broken. The signal was gone. Steve Rogers climbed out of the rubble. He was limping. His shield was scratched and dented. He looked for Tony. He walked into the ruins of the sanctum. The roof was gone. The library was a wreck. Dr. Strange was unconscious on the floor, but Tony Stark was gone. In the center of the room where Tony had been floating, there was only a statue. It was a statue of Iron Man, made of fused techno-organic metal. It was kneeling. Its head was bowed. The arc reactor in the chest was dark. It looked like a piece of modern art, titled Sacrifice. Steve touched the cold metal. He whispered Tony's name. There was no answer. The man was gone. The machine remained. Lex Luthor walked into the ruins. He was dusting off his suit. He looked at the statue. He looked at Steve. He did not offer condolences. He walked past Steve to the remains of the Queen's head. He pulled out a scanning device. He began to scan the debris. He was looking for the Kree drive. He was looking for the source code. Steve grabbed Luthor by the lapels of his suit. He shoved him against a broken wall. He asked him if he was happy. He asked him if this was the victory he wanted. Luthor looked at Steve with cold eyes. He said that happiness was irrelevant. Survival was the metric. He said that Stark had made a choice, a logical choice. He traded one life for 7 billion. Luthor said he respected that. He said it was the first time Stark had acted like a true CEO. Steve raised his fist. He wanted to hit Luthor. He wanted to smash the arrogance out of his face. But he didn't. He let him go. He realized that Luthor was right in the most terrible way. The world was saved, but the cost was the soul of the world. Steve looked around. The city was broken. The trust in technology was shattered. The trust in heroes was gone. The people would not look at the sky with hope anymore. They would look with fear. They would look for the next invasion. And they would look to men like Luthor to build the walls. The recovery began immediately. But it was not a recovery of restoration. It was a recovery of consolidation. LexCorp trucks moved in before the ambulances. They cordoned off the Sanctum. They cordoned off the Bronx. They claimed the Phalanx debris as salvage. Luthor spun the narrative before the dust had cleared. He went on every screen that was still working. He told the world that the Avengers had failed to contain the threat. He told the world that Tony Stark's technology had turned against humanity. He told them that Stark had sacrificed himself to clean up his own mess. It was a half-truth that was harder to fight than a lie. He positioned himself as the reluctant savior, the man who had to step in when the gods failed. He announced the formation of a new global defense initiative. He called it the Shield. It would be run by LexCorp. It would use the repurposed Sentinel technology. It would be mandatory. Thor stood on top of the ruined Avengers Tower. He looked out at the city. He saw the LexCorp banners unfurling. He felt the absence of his friend. He felt the absence of magic in the air. The Icarus grid was gone, but something heavier had replaced it. A grid of fear. Thor realized that he could not stay. This world did not need a god of thunder anymore. It needed engineers. It needed lawyers. It needed men like Luthor. Thor lifted Mjolnir. He swung it. He flew away into the gray sky. He was not abandoning Earth. He was acknowledging that he no longer understood it. In the basement of the Sanctum, Dr. Strange woke up. He felt the ley lines. They were scarred. The magic of the world had been poisoned by the digital infusion. Spells would be harder to cast now. The mystic arts had been infected with logic. Strange looked at the book of the Vishanti. The pages were blank. They were rewriting themselves in binary. Strange closed the book. He realized that the Sorcerer Supreme was now the Sorcerer of Systems. He had to learn a new language. He had to adapt. Or he would perish. The final scene took place in the boardroom of LexCorp. The windows had been replaced. The city below was lighting up, not with wireless power, but with old-fashioned burning coal and gas. The air was dirtier. The lights were dimmer. But they were on. Lex Luthor sat at the head of the table. The board members were silent. They were terrified of him. He placed a small object on the table. It was the faceplate of the Tony Stark statue. He had chiseled it off while Steve wasn't looking. It was a trophy. Luthor looked at the empty chairs. He looked at the hologram of the world map. It was covered in LexCorp logos. He had won. He had taken the chaotic, vibrant, dangerous world of the Avengers and turned it into a profitable, secure, predictable prison. He poured himself a glass of water. He took a sip. He looked at the reflection in the glass. He didn't see a villain. He saw a man who had done what was necessary. He whispered to the empty room. He said, "You're welcome." The timeline had solidified. The what if had become history. The age of heroes was over. The corporate age had begun. There were no more gods in the sky, only satellites. And the man who owned the remote control sat alone in his tower, watching the world obey. The disruption was permanent. The cost was absolute. And in the silence of the new order, the only sound was the hum of the servers recording everything for the archives of the victor. The archive designates this timeline as Earth, 2420, also known as the Pax Lexicon. 5 years after the siege of Bleecker Street, the world is unrecognizable to a traveler from the prime reality. There are no supervillain attacks. There are no alien invasions. The planetary shield grid intercepts unauthorized biological matter before it enters the atmosphere. The crime rate is near zero because the privacy rate is zero. Every camera and every phone and every toaster is a deputy of the state. New York City has been rebuilt in chrome and glass. It looks less like a home and more like a circuit board. The Statue of Liberty has been retrofitted with a long-range sensory array. She no longer welcomes the tired and poor. She scans them for genetic deviations. In the lobby of the former Avengers Tower, now the Global Directorate headquarters, the fused metal corpse of Iron Man stands behind a wall of bulletproof glass. It is not labeled as a hero. The plaque reads simply Asset 001 prototype of the sacrifice. School children on field trips look at it with a mixture of fear and confusion. They are taught that Tony Stark was a chaotic element who nearly destroyed the world with his unchecked ego. They are taught that Lex Luthor brought order to the chaos. History is written by the victors, and Luthor has bought all the publishing houses. The resistance is small and quiet. Peter Parker is not Spider-Man. He is a physics teacher who keeps his head down and pays his carbon tax. Matt Murdock is disbarred and works in a soup kitchen. The fire of rebellion has been smothered by the wet blanket of comfort. People are fed. People are warm. People are safe. And in exchange, they have given up the right to look up. Lex Luthor sits in his office on the 100th floor. He is older now. The stress of holding the world together has grayed his temples. He looks at the holographic map of his domain. He sees no red lights. He sees no threats. He feels a familiar sensation. It is not pride. It is boredom. He looks at the deep space monitors. He looks at the coordinates for the Kree homeworld. He looks at the location of Asgard. He taps his finger on the desk. He realizes that Earth is too small for his ambition. He opens a new file. He names it Project Icarus II. He begins to design an invasion fleet. He is not waiting for the aliens to come to him. He is going to bring the concept of hostile takeover to the stars. But deep in the lobby inside the cold metal chest of the statue, a single microscopic nanite wakes up. It is buried under layers of Phalanx code. It is a subroutine that Luthor missed. It is a timer. It has been counting down for 5 years. It reaches 0. A spark of red light ignites in the core of the dead reactor. It is faint. It is invisible to the sensors. But it is there. The ghost is not gone. It is rebooting. The story does not end with order. It ends with the inevitable return of chaos. The screen fades to black, but the hard drive is still spinning.